I never thought my own children would be the ones to put me out. I'm 71 years old, and I've spent most of my life putting their needs before mine. Birthdays, bills, even bailing them out when they made mistakes I tried not to judge. When my husband died, the house became everything I had left. Not just a roof, but a piece of him, a piece of us. When my son told me he'd help with the paperwork to make things easier for me as I got older, I believed him. I wanted to. That's what mothers do. They trust, but trust has a way of breaking you when it's misplaced. And the day I found out my house wasn't mine anymore, that it was in their name, something inside me broke too. And that's when I decided I might have lost my home, but I wasn't about to lose myself. People used to tell me my house had a good backbone. Folks meant the floors and the rafters, the way my late husband, Tom, had hand-nailed the porch just so, and how the windows still held the light the way he liked it. But when I say the house had a backbone, I mean more than that. It held a life. It held a marriage. It held a small library of birthdays and storms, and the ordinary afternoons where nothing dramatic ever happened but everything important did. When Tom died, the house became a place full of the quiet that follows the absence of someone you trusted to laugh with you at the wrong times. I stayed because leaving felt like leaving him behind twice. I have lived in that house for 40 years. I wake in the same bedroom, make my coffee in the same chipped mug, and sometimes I swear I can still hear Tom clearing his throat from the kitchen when he wanted to tell me something important and then changed his mind. I never minded that. Memory kept him close in the small ways. The folded slippers by the bed, the dent in the dining table from when his elbow knocked it one summer, and we both laughed until we cried. Those things are the kind of love that's not loud about itself. It's just there, a steady presence. My children, Melissa and Aaron, grew up in this house. They ran around the yard, learned to ride bikes down the street, came in with skinned knees and great plans for the future. I taught them to read in the evenings, tucked them in, and learned to make plans that always included them. You don't think about future betrayals when you're tucking in a 5-year-old and kissing a forehead. You think about scraped knees and spelling bees and the warmth of their tiny hands in yours. They are grown now. Melissa has 3 kids of her own and lives about 30 minutes away. Aaron moved back home for a spell a few years ago when things were complicated for him. Life has a way of making people come and go like weather. I raised them the best I could. Sometimes with rules, sometimes with tough love, sometimes with all the forgiveness I had left. Mothers do that. We imagine ourselves as the harbor that takes the storms, thinking that's our job. Besides, I wanted to help. I believe family is the place you can lay down your burdens, and I took pride in being that safe place. The truth is, there are stories that never get told about the small acts that add up. There was the winter Aaron called and said his heating had gone out and his landlord wouldn't fix it. I drove over with blankets and a little emergency fund I'd been saving, and I stayed 2 nights to help get him sorted. Melissa called once when her car broke down and I drove her to work until it was fixed. When our youngest got sick last year, I drove across town for midnight medicine and sat up on the living room couch with a mug of tea until the sun came up. Sometimes the help was money. Other times it was time. Mostly it was listening when they needed to talk and pretending I had all the answers even when I didn't. People ask whether I ever resented it, whether I kept a ledger in my head of favors owed. For a long time I didn't. Caring felt like the thread that knotted us all together, and I liked being the one who could knit. But the years teach you subtler things, the line between giving and losing yourself, how habits of help can become expectations in the hearts of those you love. I noticed the ways my children would assume I'd always be available. They stopped asking if I was free. They began telling me their plans and expecting me to fit into them. A mother's love is elastic until one day she notices it's been stretched too thin. My days were simple. I walked the neighborhood every morning and nodded at the same neighbors who'd known me for decade after decade. I volunteered at the small-town library on Tuesdays. People brought me casseroles sometimes and sat with me on the porch in the heat, trading out gossip for memories of people we'd both known. I had routines, and routines are a kind of safety. Evenings were my favorite. An open book, the hum of the refrigerator, An old radio tuned low to classical music. I kept the house tidy. I kept the garden trimmed. I kept Tom's picture on the mantel because he seemed to approve of that. Then, one afternoon over coffee, Melissa came by with a folder in her hand and a smile that was meant to be comforting. She'd come over before for errands and cake and to borrow a hammer, but this time she sat down at my kitchen table and looked like she had something to do with the heavy things in the world. "Mom," she said, folding her hands on the table, "I've been thinking about you in the house. You know how we worry sometimes. About the future, about banks, about taxes." She had that voice that's part daughter, part person, who has tried to do the math life hands you. I listened. I always listen. That's what being a mother teaches you. How to hold space without taking it away from the other person. "We thought maybe we could do a little paperwork," she said. "Just to make sure everything is in order. You know, like an estate plan. We found a lawyer who helps other families. It'll just be a quick update so you won't have to worry when you get older." Her eyes were honest. Her voice was warm. Her words were the kind a child uses when they think they are protecting their parent from something scary, like the weather. Part of me wanted to laugh. I've been through wills and paper and forms for years. When Tom was alive, we sat at that same table and signed papers that were for the household, the farm, the car, the things a life accumulates. It felt almost ceremonial, like a quiet adult thing we did together. But the other part of me, the practical part that knows how bills come due and how taxes sneak up, felt a small relief at the idea. I'd been alone a while. The idea of someone helping with the paperwork seemed sensible. Who wouldn't want their ducks in a row? So we made a plan. Melissa said she had a lawyer friend who could help make it clean and simple. "Mom, it'll just make life easier," she said. "We can list you as the primary owner, but add us as co-owners so there's no probate and no messy surprises." She smiled the way people smile when they think they're offering a clever hack to solve a problem. I trusted her. I trusted them. I would have trusted them to hold my hand through anything. There were conversations in small ways after that. Aaron called to ask about some documents, and that morning he stopped by to help with a loose tile on the porch. He hummed while he worked, and I set out lemonade. He told me about a job interview and how nervous he was, and I told him not to worry, that he had more grit than he knew. The house, the garden, the old dog-eared cookbook on the counter, those things felt like a shared language. I did not, in that moment, suspect that sharing could be a knife in the shape of a promise. People often ask me why I signed the papers. It isn't that there was pressure. It was more like a soft current that pulls at you when you love someone. Melissa explained legal terms with the patience of someone who'd studied them for hours. Aaron reassured me with jokes about how complicated the lawyers were and how he'd get it sorted. "This is for you, Ma," Melissa would say, pressing the pen into my hand. I saw the way she looked at me then. Not the small child in need of care, but an adult who wanted to ease her parents' load. That look is persuasive in ways you can't prepare for. I remember the afternoon I signed. It was sunny and warm, and the kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. I held the pen and watched the blue ink trail across the paper. There was a line where it asked who the owners would be and how the property would be held. I read it over slowly. The words co-owner and survivorship were there in neat print. Melissa said it would prevent court hassles and make it easy on everyone if anything happened. She said everyone like it was a kindness. My hand didn't shake. I felt oddly proud to have children who wanted to protect me. After I signed, Melissa squeezed my hand and said, "There. Now you won't have to worry." And I believed her because worry is heavy, and it felt nice to lay it down. After they left, I put the folder in the small safe where I kept important papers. I stared at the safe for a while, thinking about how the house had always felt like a promise between Tom and me. I liked the idea that maybe, in some practical way, it would stay in the family. I went about my day making tea, watering the geraniums, and humming along to the radio. I didn't imagine for a second that the simple act of signing my name would be the first stitch in a seam that might one day unravel. There were moments that followed which, looking back, seemed small and almost ordinary, but each one had a way of gathering meaning. My daughter started suggesting rearrangements. A new rug here, a fresh coat of paint there. "It'll brighten the place," she'd say. And I'd agree because I liked light, and because I liked the thought she cared enough to want the house to look pretty. My son began paying a few bills when his work was steady for a month or two. It felt natural, like family doing what family does. All of that felt wholesome until it started to feel like the house was being reshaped without me. And that change, that soft, almost loving thing that first whispered about paperwork, was the place where a different story began. A story that I could not have known then needed a map, and a lawyer, and a hand that could be steadier than mine. But for that afternoon, at the kitchen table with the sunlight catching the crumbs of our conversation, it felt like a small kindness disguised as common sense. The kind of kindness a mother would welcome. I tucked the folder back into the safe and went on with my evening, humming a tune Tom used to whistle. In my head, I told myself what I always tell myself when life hands me a new thing. Be grateful, be patient, be wise. I did not know then how much wisdom I would need. I only knew that I had tried to do right by my children, as mothers do, and that the house, with its good backbone, was meant to be a place where we all belonged. The next morning, Melissa called to say she had some more ideas for making sure everything stayed simple. Her voice was as bright as a bell. I answered with my usual warmth, unaware that the bell would soon ring in a different tone. The folder Melissa brought that day stayed on my kitchen counter longer than I wanted to admit. I'd move it from one side to the other, sometimes on the table, sometimes on top of the bread box, as if changing its place might make the decision inside it lighter. Every time I passed it, I'd hear Melissa's voice in my head saying, "It's just for protection, Mom. Just to make things simple later." I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. That's the part that still hurts, because trust doesn't break with one big sound. It gives out softly, like an old floorboard under familiar footsteps. A week after our talk, Melissa came back with Aaron. It was a Sunday morning. I was in the middle of baking bread, the same recipe Tom used to love, with honey and oats on top. And the house smelled warm and safe. I remember thinking that everything about that day felt peaceful. The window light was gold, the radio was playing softly, and for a moment, I let myself feel proud of the life I'd built. My kids were grown, they were doing their best, and even though things weren't always easy, we still had this. The comfort of a family that stayed connected. When they came in, Melissa had that same folder tucked under her arm, and Aaron carried 2 cups of coffee from the corner cafe. He handed one to me and smiled. "Mom, this one's your favorite," he said, setting it down beside me. "No sugar, just cream. We thought we'd go over the last few things while you've got a minute." I smiled back, because that's what you do when your children show up trying to help. "You two always find your way in here before church," I said. Melissa laughed. "Well, somebody's got to keep you organized." "Mom," she said it playfully, but there was something in her voice. That soft confidence adult children get when they feel like they're stepping into the parent role for a moment. They spread the papers out on the table like a Sunday crossword, pages full of small print and clean lines. "It's just to make things clear," Melissa said again, tapping her manicured finger on the first page. "It lists you as the current owner, and we'll just add our names so that if anything ever happens, we don't have to go through probate or lawyers or any of that nonsense." Aaron leaned back in his chair and nodded. "Yeah, this is how people do it now. It's smart. Saves money in the long run." I wanted to say something about how Tom and I never needed fancy papers to trust each other, but the words didn't come. Instead, I stared at the neat black letters and thought about how much I hated legal talk, how far away it felt from the life I lived inside this home. Melissa must have noticed the hesitation in my face, because she reached over and touched my hand gently. "Mom," she said, her tone soft, careful. "This doesn't change anything. It's still your house. We're just making sure you're protected. If something happens, it won't get tied up in court. You always said you wanted things simple. That was true. I did. After Tom passed, I told her more than once that I didn't want them to fight over things when I was gone. "I've seen families torn apart over who gets what," I'd said. "All I want is peace when I go." And so she had listened. Or so I thought. We went through the pages slowly. I could barely make sense of the legal words, but Melissa explained each one, and Aaron nodded along, filling in with jokes now and then to keep the mood light. "Look at us," he said once. "A real family business meeting. We should have brought donuts." I laughed a little, because I always did. Humor was his way of keeping me at ease. When it came time to sign, I hesitated just a second. There was a small line on one of the forms that caught my eye: joint tenancy with right of survivorship. I didn't know what it meant exactly, but the word survivorship made my chest tighten a bit. Melissa noticed. "Oh, that just means if something happens, it'll pass right to us. No courts, no waiting, no outsiders touching the house. It's just paperwork, Mom." I nodded. I trusted her. I picked up the pen and signed where they told me. Afterward, they both smiled. Wide, proud smiles, like they'd just done something kind and meaningful. Melissa patted my hand again. "See? Easy. Now you don't have to worry about a thing." I remember her saying that as the oven timer went off, the bread's crust golden and cracking in the heat. I pulled it out, brushed it with butter, and set it on the cooling rack. They both said it smelled like childhood. For a moment, everything felt right again. The warm kitchen, the laughter, the comfort of being needed. When they left, I waved from the porch, the same way I always did, and watched them drive down the street. Melissa's kids were in the back seat, waving out the window. My heart swelled like it always did. Family. That word still meant everything to me then. Life went on the way it always had, or so it seemed. Sunday dinners stayed a tradition. Melissa brought the kids, Aaron brought his charm, and I brought the food: chicken and biscuits, collard greens, cobbler in the summer. We'd sit at that long oak table, the one Tom built with his own hands, and laugh about everything and nothing. I'd watch them, my children, my grandchildren, and feel grateful. I didn't see anything wrong, not really. The papers were long forgotten, tucked in the safe beside old photos and Tom's watch. But sometimes, when the evening quieted down after everyone left, I'd find myself sitting alone in the living room, the clock ticking steady against the wall, and something small would stir in me, a question I couldn't quite name. It was subtle, like a faint draft you can't find the source of. Maybe it was the way Aaron sometimes mentioned the family house now, or the way Melissa started giving advice about maintenance. "Mom, you should get the gutters done before winter. I'll schedule someone." Little things, nothing sharp enough to alarm me, but small changes have a way of whispering truth before you're ready to hear it. One evening I was on the porch trimming dead leaves from my potted plants when my neighbor Gloria stopped by with her dog. We chatted about her daughter's engagement, the usual small-town things. Then she said, "Oh, honey, I saw your son and daughter leaving the courthouse last week. Everything all right?" I blinked, confused. "The courthouse?" Gloria nodded, adjusting the leash in her hand. Could have been business or something. They looked like they were meeting someone official. She smiled kindly and added, "Maybe getting you that power of attorney you mentioned." I smiled back, pretending I understood, pretending it didn't tug at me. But after she left, I sat on that porch longer than usual, watching the evening light change. The next few weeks carried on quietly. Melissa stopped by less, always saying she was busy with the kids. Aaron called sometimes, but rarely came in person. I told myself that was normal. Children get busy, life moves forward. Still, every time the phone rang, I found myself hoping it was them. In late spring, I made the mistake of looking for the papers again. I hadn't intended to. I was organizing my safe, sorting through tax documents, and there it was. That same folder with their lawyer friend's name stamped across the top. I opened it just to check that everything was still in order. Most of it was unreadable to me, the kind of legal talk that twists language into knots. but I noticed something new. A form dated after the day I signed, with both Melissa and Aaron's signatures listed beside mine. Next to mine, someone had initialed something in handwriting that didn't look quite like mine at all. I stared at it for a long time. Not angry yet, not afraid, just uncertain. When I asked Melissa about it later that week, she brushed it off with a practiced calm. "Oh, that's just part of the filing process, Mom. We had to add a witness signature. You know how lawyers are." She smiled, kissed my cheek, and said, "You really don't have to worry about all that. Everything's fine." And because I wanted to believe her, I let it go. Again, summer came, and with it the same routines. I planted my flowers, baked my bread, hosted dinners, kept the house running like clockwork. Life looked the same on the outside, but I think the truth had already started shifting beneath me. I just couldn't see it yet. Sometimes when you love people, you mistake their certainty for honesty. You think the calm in their voice means safety, but I was beginning to sense, in ways too gentle to name, that something about our family's rhythm had changed. The papers were signed. The laughter returned. The house still smelled like Sunday supper, but beneath the warmth of it all, something fragile had started to crack. And though I couldn't see it then, that quiet little crack was about to open wide enough to swallow everything I thought I owned. It started with little things, quiet changes that, at first, didn't seem worth worrying about. That's how trouble usually comes into your life. Soft-footed, polite and smiling. A few weeks after I signed those papers, the house began to feel different. It wasn't anything I could point to, not at first. It was more like a shift in temperature you can't see but feel in your bones. The rhythm of the place had changed. Aaron stopped by one afternoon with a clipboard under his arm and a grin on his face. "Hey, Mom," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I just wanted to talk to you about property taxes. I called the county office earlier." I paused mid-wipe, holding a damp dish towel in my hand. "Property taxes?" I asked, surprised. "Why would you call them?" "I already pay those every quarter, same as always." He smiled, a little too easy. "Yeah, about that. Since we're co-owners now, it just makes sense for me to handle that stuff, you know? Streamline it. They'll probably send the bills under my name now, but don't worry, I've got it covered." It took me a second to process that. "Under your name?" He nodded. "Just paperwork. It's all the same, Mom. You don't have to lift a finger." He said it kindly, as if he were doing me a favor. But there was something strange about the way the word co-owner hung in the air. The sound of it made my stomach tighten. It felt foreign, wrong somehow. I tried to smile. "That's kind of you, Aaron. I just hope it doesn't get confusing." He patted my shoulder like he was the parent and I was the child. "It won't. I'll take care of everything." And that was that. But that night, as I washed my face and got ready for bed, I couldn't stop replaying that moment. Since we're co-owners now, he said it so naturally, like it had always been that way. I stood at the sink, looking at my reflection, an old woman with silver hair and tired eyes, and told myself I was being silly. "You signed the papers," I said out loud, to no one. "It's fine." But the words didn't sound convincing, not even to me. Then came the decorating. Melissa had always loved rearranging things, even as a little girl. But lately, she'd been coming by more often with paint swatches and ideas. "Mom, this wall needs a fresh color," she said one Saturday morning, holding up a pale cream sample. "Something that'll brighten the space. You've had this same dull beige for years." Before I could answer, she was already moving the couch to the other side of the room. She had that determined look in her eye, the one she used to get when she wanted something, and had already decided the answer was yes. I stood there, watching her take down the framed photo of me and Tom on our anniversary, the one that had hung above the mantel for decades. "Wait," I said gently. "Leave that one. I like it there." "Oh, Mom," she said with a laugh. "I'm not getting rid of it. I'm just moving it to the hallway. It'll look better there, trust me." She smiled at me like she was humoring a child, and before I could protest again, She'd wrapped the frame in newspaper. When she finished painting, I had to admit, the room did look brighter, cleaner, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. The walls smelled of fresh paint and change, my memories. All the small ghosts that had lived in that house with me felt like they'd been moved, boxed up, made to stand in line and wait for permission to belong. Melissa seemed proud of herself. "See," she said, hands on her hips. "You should have done this years ago. I might just have to help you update the guest room next." I smiled because mothers learn to smile through things, but something in my chest ached quietly. Over the next few weeks, more of those little things began to pile up. Nothing loud enough to be called trouble, but each one a tiny echo of something off-kilter. The mail, for one. It started showing up addressed differently. At first it was harmless enough, the Walker family. Then it became Melissa Walker or Helen Walker. And then, one morning I stood at my mailbox holding an envelope that said Melissa Walker, property owner. I remember staring at it for a long time, the sun already high and hot on the back of my neck. It was a letter from the bank. My heart sank a little, even though I didn't yet understand why. That night, I brought it inside and left it on the kitchen table. I told myself I wouldn't open it, that it was probably some automated letter, nothing important. But curiosity has a way of working on you, slowly but surely, especially when something doesn't sit right. The house was quiet. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hall. Finally, I slipped the letter open. It was a routine notice about escrow and insurance updates. Harmless words, but there it was in bold print at the top. Account holder, Melissa Walker. My hands went cold. I picked up the phone and called her. It was late, and I half expected her not to answer. But she did, cheerful as always. "Hey, Mom! Everything okay?" I hesitated. "I just got a letter from the bank. It had your name on it," said property owner. "Why would that be?" There was a pause, just a beat too long. Then she laughed softly. "Oh, that? It's nothing, Mom. Just an administrative thing. They must have updated it since my name's on the account now. It's no big deal. No big deal," I repeated. "I just wasn't expecting it, that's all." Her voice softened, like she was talking to a child who'd had a bad dream. "Mom, you're overthinking again. You always worry about these things. Everything's fine. I promise." I wanted to believe her, so I let it go. Or at least I tried to. But once you've seen a crack in the glass, you can't unsee it. Over the following days, little details kept catching my eye. Aaron started referring to repairs around the house as our investment. Melissa began stopping by without calling first, rearranging decorations or bringing new curtains to freshen things up. One afternoon, she told me she'd given a spare key to a friend of hers who might help keep an eye on the place. I didn't argue. But when she left that day, I took my spare key off the hook and slipped it into my pocket, just in case. At night, I started walking through the rooms quietly, the way I used to when my children were small and sleeping. But this time I wasn't checking on anyone. I was checking on myself, making sure the world I'd built hadn't completely shifted while I wasn't looking. One evening, Aaron stopped by with pizza, saying he wanted to catch up. We sat at the kitchen table, just the two of us. Halfway through dinner, he casually mentioned talking to the tax office again. They said they'll be sending future correspondence to me directly, he said, taking another bite. Makes things smoother that way. Something in me bristled. You mean the property tax office? He nodded, mouth full. Yeah, they'll have my name on file now. Don't worry, Mom, I'll make sure it's all handled. I'm not letting anything slip through the cracks. Handled. That word stuck in my chest. When he left, I sat in that same chair long after the dishes were cleared, staring at the table's wooden grain. That table had held every birthday cake, every Thanksgiving meal, every piece of laughter and argument our family ever shared. It had been my foundation, but that night, it felt like something steady had gone soft beneath my hands. I began to realize how much had changed, not in one big moment, but through small, deliberate shifts. My name was still on the doorbell, but my presence in that house was starting to feel like a guest's, polite, temporary, tolerated. The warmth hadn't disappeared entirely, but it wasn't mine anymore. The laughter that used to belong to our family had taken on a new tone, one that left me slightly outside the circle. Then, one morning, I went to the mailbox and found a small stack of letters. 2 were bills addressed to me, and one, thick, official-looking, bore Melissa's name again, followed by that title that had become my quiet nightmare, property owner. The letters fluttered slightly in my hand as I stood there, the air still and heavy. I looked up at my house, the home my husband and I built with our own sweat, our own love, and for the first time, it didn't feel like it was looking back at me. I didn't open that letter. I didn't need to. Something inside me already knew. The ground beneath my feet had shifted, and even if the world around me still looked the same, the flowers, the curtains, the sunlight through the window, it wasn't mine anymore. I folded the letter neatly and set it on the counter. That's where it stayed for days, untouched, whispering every time I walked past. Something's not right, and deep down, I finally started to believe it. The church service that afternoon had been the same gentle ritual it always was. The choir's hymn rising like steam, the pastor's soft words about kindness, the small, familiar quilt of faces folding into the pews. I left feeling lighter than I had all week. The kind of light you feel when you've taken time to pray for something, and then set it down for a while. The sky was a clear blue when I walked back down the lane, and the breeze smelled like cut grass and honeysuckle. I carried my little canvas tote with a loaf of leftover bread and a few oranges for dessert, thinking about nothing more complicated than the recipe I'd make for dinner. The porch smelled the way it always does, cedar and lemon-scented cleaner. The screen door rasped as I pushed it open, and at first everything looked the same. The faded welcome mat, Tom's old rocking chair slightly angled as if waiting for him to come back and sit. Then I saw the boxes, a neat stack of cardboard along the side of the porch, flaps closed and taped, with my sweaters on top, and a small lamp peeking out from the corner of one. My heart made a little surprised flip that I didn't recognize right away. I thought perhaps they were the new neighbor's deliveries or something left mistakenly on the step. But the boxes were mine. My knitting basket, my teacups wrapped in newspaper, the framed photograph of Tom and me on our honeymoon. I stepped inside and tried the doorknob. It wouldn't turn. The metal felt cool and final under my palm. I pushed harder, as if the house might yell back that it was a mistake, and a small, heavy sound answered me from the other side. The sound of a lock that no longer belonged to me. My first breathing wasn't a sob. It was a slow, astonished intake, like the one you take when you realize you've left your purse on the roof of the car. For a second, I stood there and hoped someone would call out, "Surprise!" and laugh, and that I would laugh along for not seeing the joke. Nobody did. I looked to the porch and then down the street. The car was gone. There was a note taped to the front window in Melissa's tidy handwriting. It said, "We love you, Mom. Please stay with Aunt Joan for a while we sort things out." The words were polite and small, but they sat on the glass like a window pane of a different house, one I did not recognize as mine. It's strange how fast the world can rearrange itself. One moment the kitchen is a kitchen, and the table is the place where you've always counted change and blessed loaves, and the next moment the same table is an exhibit of someone else's thought. I walked the perimeter of the house on that warm afternoon like someone learning the map of a place I thought I knew by heart. My thumbs found the safe tucked behind the bread box. The key had been moved, the key to the little cedar chest in the bedroom where Tom's watch slept. The key was gone. The things you think are steady, keys, light switches, the dent in the stair, felt suddenly as if they'd been loaned to you and then quietly reclaimed. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the sun on my face, staring at the boxes and the empty doorway. Neighbors looked on from their yards, some offering murmured concern across the hedge. Gloria from next door waved and mouthed, "Are you okay?" and I forced a small smile, because there's a dignity in not collapsing in front of everyone you've waved to for 40 years. But once I turned and walked to my car, the small smile slipped. My steps felt foreign on the familiar path. At my sister Joan's house, the kettle was already on. Joan is the kind of woman who folds towels into neat rectangles and keeps a calendar for everyone she cares about. She opened the door and hugged me with her whole body, the way sisters do when they know there's no polite way to enter the room where sorrow sits. She looked at my hands, at the boxes in the back of my car, and she said, "Helen, come sit." There was a firmness in her voice I needed. Inside her kitchen, with sunlight slanting across the table and the smell of tea rising, I sat with the bag on my lap like a pilgrim who had come in off the road. Melissa called while I was there. Her voice was airy, practiced, the voice of someone tending a crisis with a tidy checklist. "Mom, we had to change things quickly because of some paperwork," she said. "It was better to move your things for now. You're safer with Joan, and we'll have everything sorted in no time." I promise, I listened. I wanted to protest. I wanted to say that the house had walls that remembered, and that you couldn't just move years into boxes and tape the seams. But I couldn't find the words that would keep my voice from shaking, and I have always believed that anger should be used like medicine, sparingly, and when it helps. So instead I said, "All right, dear," because I still wanted to believe. Because my heart wanted the children I raised to always be the people who took care of me. Because maybe, in the gentlest light, it was possible they had done this with good intentions. That night, when the kids had fallen asleep on couches and Joan's nightlight hummed softly, I laid my head on the pillow that had once smelled like my own house and cried like someone whose tears had been saving up for a long time. It wasn't loud. It was a quiet, steady thing that soaked the pillow. There was no dramatic shouting, no doors slamming. The house where I stayed that night felt like a borrowed garment, warm, serviceable, but not mine. My tears were not of shock alone. They carried the weight of all the small compromises I had made over the years, the loans given quietly, the nights kept vigil, the favors done without counting. They were also a grief I had not yet named, the grief of being made to feel unnecessary in the very place that once made me central. I didn't call the police. I didn't march back to the porch and make a scene. I sat with Joan in the quiet small hours and we talked about the weather and the neighbor's dog, and then gently about the facts. "Did they change the deed?" she asked, practical as always. "Did you really sign away anything you didn't mean to?" I told her about the papers, about how the words had sounded sensible then, about the day I signed, the way the ink had dried and looked ordinary, like any other weekday task. She listened without interrupting, the way a woman who'd seen storms knows how to let the wind pass. Then she said, "We'll look through everything tomorrow. We'll call someone. You don't have to deal with this alone." There is a kind of betrayal that looks like care. That was the cruelest part. The soft voice, the tidy explanations, the assurances that you are being protected as they move the pieces. "For your own good" can be the most devastating sentence, because it wraps cruelty in tenderness and makes it difficult to resist. My children used that sentence carefully, as if they believed it themselves. Perhaps they did. Perhaps where I saw wrongdoing, they saw an efficient solution. But the boxes on my porch, those cardboard seals, felt less like efficiency and more like erasure. In the days that followed, I watched them unload my life into crates and carry it away with the same calm you'd use carrying a casserole to a potluck. Efficient, thoughtful, unaware of the way the place you take from might still be sitting quietly in the doorway, waiting for you to come back. Melissa texted photos of the house with new curtains and a suggestion about paint colors, punctuated with hearts. Aaron sent messages about tax schedules and streamlining estate planning, followed by a selfie of the two of them at a cafe with cups of coffee between them and smiles that belonged together. They wanted me to be reassured. They wanted me to see that nothing was wrong. Their words were careful and soothing, like medicine served in small doses. But at night, in my sister's guest room, I learned a more private truth. You can have all the love in the world and still be used. You can be the anchor in a family for decades, and then, when the tide changes, you find the anchor cut and carried away. That realization settled in me not like a fist, but like a slow ring spreading in water. It was painful in a patient way. It made me aware of places I had softened, of ways I had allowed my life to be a service station for other people's tires. It made me aware that love without boundary can be mistaken for permission. Woman who had been an anchor, the one who ironed school, uniforms and collected lost mittens at the bus. Stop began to remember other parts of herself lately, the parts that had been quietly set aside. She remembered she had opinions, that she had friends, that she had a name not just beside Mom. She remembered Tom's way of looking at her across the table, the small joke he always told when he wanted to make her laugh. She remembered that she liked reading late and sometimes thought of taking a watercolor class she had once shelved for later. The grief made room for something else. Clarity. Sitting up in the dark and listening to Joan's slow breathing next door, the anger that might have once been too hot and quick turned into a cooler, more persistent resolve. I thought about my house, about the oak tree I'd planted with Tom when the children were small, about the dent on the stair he'd joked into being character. Those were not things to be boxed or moved. They were witness to a life. I began to understand that if you allow people to rearrange your home, they can also rearrange your story. I closed my eyes and felt a small but steady flame of recognition. I had given a lot. I had loved entirely and without calculation. And perhaps that had been my defining gift. But now that gift had been treated like a resource to be used without renewal. That was not something I could accept quietly. Not because I wanted to be bitter, but because I had to be practical. I had to find a way to stand in the space that was mine. I had to remember I was not only a harbor, I was also a woman who could chart a course. When dawn came, I rose with the same slow care I always had. Joan made me egg and toast and pushed a cup of tea into my hands. We spoke in measured sentences about next steps the way women plan for storms. One thing at a time. I felt a steadiness I hadn't known I owned. The hurt was still raw, and the memory of the boxes would likely remain like a bruise, but there was a new current running under it. It wasn't fury so much as a clear-eyed decision. I would not let the rest of my life be decided for me without my voice, and as I packed a small overnight bag of what I wanted to keep close, the watch Tom had left me, the small stack of letters he once wrote, the knitting needles that had outlived stubborn sweaters, I realized something else. The things those boxes could not hold were already safely inside me. The lessons I'd taught, the patience I'd given, the quiet strength that had kept us through bad winters. Those were not things anybody could tape up and carry off. They were not things you could sign away with a pen placed in a hand you thought you could trust. So I folded my sweater, tucked the letters into my bag, and felt the modest weight of them against my palm. My sister poured a little more tea, and we sat at the window watching the day begin. Outside, the oak's branches moved like a slow, steady hand. It comforted me to see that. It reminded me that some things endure, even when people change. And in that reminder, a small part of me began to clear the space for what might come next. When I first decided not to let it go, I didn't know I was making a strategy. I only knew I couldn't live the rest of my days wondering and hoping and pretending. The boxes on my porch had felt like an accusation. The polite notes and the for-your-own-good rehearsals felt like a verdict passed without a trial. So I sat with Joan, and we made tea, and then I started making quiet calls. Not loud ones, not the kind that attract attention, but small, steady steps toward the truth. One of those calls was to Ruth, an old friend from the library who had a way of telling the right book to the right person. Ruth had retired years ago and moved to a small town 2 counties over, but she still remembered me, and remembered how my husband and I used to always choose the best biographies for the history shelf. When I told her what had happened, she didn't gasp or say what a shame it was. She listened, and when I finished, she said softly, "Come by tomorrow. I can help." I didn't know then that Ruth had been a lawyer before she took early retirement to read full-time. I remembered her as patient, and when she put down her cup, she said the one thing that steadied me. "We'll look at the papers." We spread everything out on her kitchen table. The way you arrange pieces of a puzzle without yet knowing the picture you want. There were photocopies from the clerk's office, bank notices, the folder from the lawyer Melissa had introduced me to. Ruth's fingers, though older, were precise. She read the deeds like a woman reading the fine print of a contract she'd written herself. After a while, she looked up and said, "Helen, these signatures don't match." She pointed to parchment that looked nearly identical to the forms I'd signed. But certain marks were off. Little flourishes in the handwriting were missing, and one line where I'd initialed had a faint wrong slope. Her voice was kind but slow, as if she were saying something that needed to be believed slowly. "We should get a handwriting expert and request bank records. This is not the neat updating you were told about." I remember the way my hands chilled then, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden disorienting clarity that the people who'd raised me had, in one small move, tried to make me invisible. Ruth made the calls. She knew where to send letters. She knew which clerk to ask for copies from, and which offices would be patient with an old woman whose voicemails might otherwise be ignored. It felt like a blessing to have someone who could move through the bureaucracy with a steady hand. It made me feel less alone. We found things. Little by little, the picture became clearer. There were bank transfers that didn't match the story Melissa and Aaron had told about, covering the bills. Several checks had been made out to names that looked like mine but had been signed with a different flourish at the end, an extra loop, where mine never looped. There were emails from the lawyer that used phrases I didn't recognize. There were supposed witness signatures that, when traced back, seemed to belong to people who had no recollection of attending any meeting with me. Ruth ordered a handwriting comparison through a forensic document examiner who worked in a neighboring city. He looked at a sample of my handwriting, old letters, a grocery list I'd kept, and compared them to the signatures on the forms. That long-awaited report arrived with its dry language. Multiple signatures and initials were inconsistent with known exemplars. In plain English, it meant someone had copied my hand. It hurt to know someone had pretended to be me. The violation felt intimate, like someone had come into my home and rearranged the photographs and written their own notes in the margins of my life. But the report also gave me something I hadn't had before. A foothold. Ruth's eyes shone when she told me, "We can use this in court. Elder financial abuse is taken very seriously these days." She explained patiently that the law recognizes when someone exploits an older person's trust and manipulates their resources. The words felt new and legal and fierce all at once. We didn't tell Melissa or Aaron what we were doing. I didn't want to give them the chance to cover things up or to hide records. Ruth advised quiet, and I learned to wait in a way I hadn't in decades. Waiting felt different now. It wasn't passive. It was gathering energy. We requested copies of all bank statements, traced transfers through the local credit union, subpoenaed the lawyer's notes. Everything we could find that would show a pattern instead of a single explainable error. My sister Joan helped by coming over to sit with me while Ruth made the calls. There were many cups of tea and small meals that tasted like normalcy in the middle of a storm. The legal process moved at its own pace. There were hearings where Ruth would stand and ask for temporary restraining measures on certain accounts, where the judge would listen to her reasoned, patient words. I sat at the back of the courtroom at first, the familiar woodwork and high, echoing ceiling making me feel small. But each time I attended, I felt a little steadier. The court clerk would call my name, and I would stand like someone answering to the truth. People looked at me sometimes with the curious expression reserved for those whose private lives have become public, but I kept my face calm. I learned how to breathe in the courtroom. Long, slow inhales and even longer exhales until the letters and numbers the lawyers used didn't sound like a foreign language anymore. There were moments I won't forget. One day, Ruth handed me a list of transactions and said quietly, "See this? These transfers from your account to their accounts have no clear purpose. There's a pattern of withdrawals and payments to businesses neither of them have ever owned. That's not normal." I remember the tightness in my chest, then a strange relief. Proof felt like a lantern in a room that had been half dark for too long. The facts line up, and if they do, a judge will listen. The first time I sat with the forensic examiner, he explained things in a plain voice. He showed me the sample signatures and the differences the human eye often misses. Forgery is not always a dramatic flourish, he said. Sometimes it's small. He lifted a magnifying glass and pointed. I watched the little differences like a detective in a novel, and the pieces repaired themselves into something that made sense. Not a simple misunderstanding, not an administrative oversight, but a careful plan. It was a hard thing to look at. It was also a gift to have eyes that could see for me. We filed suit. The complaint cited elder financial exploitation and requested that the court void the transfers and return title. While the paperwork moved through the system, Ruth and I met quietly with the county clerk and the mortgage office. We asked for copies of deeds, and when those arrived, we compared dates and notations until the timeline of events lined up. We found, in the end, that a purported witness's signature had been forged, that certain forms had been backdated, and that the co-ownership had been executed with knowledge that I might not fully understand the ramifications. It wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was a stack of paper that told the same story in unrelenting detail. On the first day of the courtroom hearing where the main evidence was presented, I wore the blue dress Tom had liked. It felt like a small private armor. I sat with Ruth and Joan near the front. The room smelled like old leather and polished wood. Melissa and Aaron sat across from us, surprised, I think, to see me there in the suit they had imagined I'd never figure out. Their faces were a mixture of annoyance and something softer. Shame, perhaps, though they tried to hide it under a veil of indifference. Ruth stood and spoke carefully. She laid out the bank transfers, the inconsistent signatures, the expert's report. She spoke about patterns of coercion and of vulnerability that make older adults targets for manipulation. The judge listened with a face that made you feel seen. A person who had heard similar stories and knew how carefully to weigh them. The opposing counsel tried to paint the transfers as family assistance and the signatures as clerical quirks. But when Ruth called the forensic examiner to the stand, and he explained, calmly and plainly, how the handwriting did not match, the room took a breath. Facts, it turns out, are stubborn things. There were moments of tension when Melissa's lawyer would question the intent, and Aaron's explanations would spin like a web. But the paper trail did not bend to excuse. The forgery looked deliberate. The loan explanations were thin. The transfers were inconsistent with the story they told at the kitchen table. When the judge asked Melissa directly whether she had witnessed the signing in the presence of an independent notary, the answer was evasive. The gaps widened. Finally, after the evidence had been carefully set before the court, the judge spoke. He used a phrase that settled in my chest like a bell. Elder financial abuse. He described the facts with a precision that left no room for the soft language of "for your own good." He ordered that the deed be restored to my name, and that certain accounts be frozen pending further recovery. He spoke about the presumption of vulnerability when someone leverages a parent's trust for personal gain. It felt like someone naming something you've seen but until then could not call. He said it plainly. The law stands to protect those who are taken advantage of, even by their own family. I remember standing when the gavel fell. The noise seemed not loud so much as decisive, like a key finally sliding into place. The victory didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like a quiet unlocking. I walked out into the sunlight with Ruth at my side and Joan holding my arm. People in the courthouse looked at us with the small kindness that comes when a wrong is righted. Melissa and Aaron were there too, their faces a mixture of anger and humiliation. They didn't approach. I didn't speak then, not because there was nothing to say, but because some wins are best worn quietly. I put my hand on my bag and felt the small weight of the possessions I'd carried away. I thought of the oak tree in my yard and of the way Tom used to hum when he painted the porch. I thought of the years I'd given without keeping count, and I also thought of the years I had left. Outside the courthouse, the air tasted like new rain. People moved along the sidewalk as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Ruth hugged me and whispered, "You were brave." Joan kissed my cheek and said, "You did the right thing." I nodded because whatever else had been broken, I had found a way to hold myself together. That night, back at my sister's house, I slept with a peace I hadn't felt since the boxes first appeared on my porch. The fight had been quiet, methodical, and in the end, just. The law had recognized what I had known in my bones. That trust, once weaponized, becomes theft. The reclamation was not dramatic. It was steady and small. The kind of victory a woman who'd raised children and kept a household would understand. I had my house back, and with it a new sense of boundary I had not had before. The next morning, I would go home and walk through each room slowly, like someone greeting an old friend. I would sift through boxes and decide what to keep and what to let go. But that night I simply let the quiet settle around me, a blanket that smelled a little like freedom. It's been nearly 8 months since the court gave me back my home. 8 months since I turned the key in that familiar door and felt the quiet sigh of the house welcome me again, like an old friend who'd been waiting without judgment. The first time I stepped inside, I didn't rush to unpack or clean or rearrange. I just stood there in the entryway breathing. The air smelled faintly of dust and lavender, like memory itself. The walls, though bare in some places, still remembered. I could almost hear echoes of the life that had lived here before the papers and the courtrooms and the whispers of betrayal. The sound of Tom's laugh in the kitchen, the children's feet running down the hallway, the old clock ticking like a heartbeat that never stopped. I didn't cry that day, not because there was nothing left to cry for, but because I had already shed every tear that needed to be shed. What came over me instead was a deep, steady calm, a peace that didn't ask for permission. The house was emptier than it used to be. Fewer things on the shelves, fewer photographs on the walls. I sold or gave away most of what didn't matter anymore. I didn't do it out of bitterness. I just wanted to make space for air, for light, for myself. You learn, after losing things you thought were unlosable, that the only things worth keeping are the ones that make you breathe easier. The living room, once full of family noise, now carries a different kind of music. The hum of quiet, the soft sound of a kettle warming on the stove, the rustle of the newspaper on a Sunday morning. I talk to Tom's picture sometimes, the one on the mantel. He's smiling the same easy smile he always had, the kind that reached his eyes. I tell him what's changed, how the kids don't call as often, how I've started growing tomatoes again, how I finally painted the porch that he always said he'd get to next weekend. Sometimes I think he's listening. Sometimes when the sunlight falls just right through the kitchen window, I can almost feel him there beside me, not as a ghost, but as a quiet memory that's found its peace too. Melissa and Aaron haven't been by. Not since the court ruling. I don't know if it's shame or anger that keeps them away. Maybe a little of both. There's an ache in that, of course. A mother's love doesn't switch off just because it's been misused, but the ache is softer now. Time doesn't erase pain. It just teaches you how to live alongside it. I still keep photos of them on the dresser. Not to remind myself of what they did, but to remember who they were before all this. Before greed, before paperwork, before we all forgot what family was supposed to mean. Sometimes when the seasons shift, I think about the house the way I used to think about my children, wanting to protect it, nurture it, keep it safe. But the truth is, this home doesn't need my protection anymore. It needs my presence, my laughter, my peace. So that's what I give it now. In the mornings, I make tea and sit by the window with the curtains open, letting the sun fill the room. The oak tree in the front yard is taller than it used to be, though the years have made its trunk hollow in spots. I like that about it, the way it keeps standing even with its missing parts. Sometimes, when the wind moves through the branches, I imagine it whispering, "We're still here." The garden has come back to life, too. The soil was stubborn at first, but I worked it slowly, the way you coax a tired heart to trust again. I planted roses and marigolds, a few tomato vines, and herbs for cooking. The first time the garden bloomed, I caught myself smiling without realizing it. It was a small, private smile, the kind that sneaks up on you when you realize you've survived something that tried to take the best of you. There's quiet in my days now, but it's the good kind. The kind that feels earned. I don't fill every moment with noise anymore. I let the stillness speak. In that stillness, I've learned to forgive, not for their sake but for mine. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about deciding that the hurt doesn't get to live rent-free in your heart anymore. People in town still ask me, sometimes gently, "Have you heard from them?" And I smile. Not to hide anything, but because I've learned how to answer without breaking my peace. "No," I say, and that's all right. There was a time I would have done anything to fix it, to bring them back, to understand why. But I don't need to understand anymore. Some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be accepted. My children made their choices. I've made mine, and my choice is peace. Every now and then a letter arrives. Short, polite ones. Melissa writes about her kids. Aaron sometimes asks if I'm doing well. I always respond kindly. Not warmly, but kindly. Boundaries don't erase love. They just teach it new rules. I've learned how to love my children from a safe distance. How to wish them well without handing them the keys to my world again. One evening not long ago, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the sunset settle over the yard. The sky was soft orange and pink, the kind of light that makes even ordinary things, the fence, the flowers, the worn steps, look touched by grace. I thought about how much this house had seen. The years of love, the loss, the betrayal, the rebuilding. It had witnessed every version of me. The mother, the widow, the fool, the fighter, and now, the woman who made it through. I realized then that the house wasn't just home again. It was a mirror. It stood solid and quiet, weathered but unbroken, and for the first time in a long time, I saw myself the same way. There's a line I say to myself sometimes when the nights get long. I gave them everything a mother could. But this time, I gave myself something too, a home I won't ever sign away again. When I say it out loud, it's not out of pride. It's out of gratitude, for the strength I didn't know I had, for the chance to start over at an age when people think life is winding down, for the lesson that it's never too late to come home to yourself. Now when I walk through these rooms, I don't see what was taken. I see what remains, and what's been restored. The soft hum of peace, the way the afternoon light hits the picture frames, the smell of bread baking again after so long. The laughter of my grandkids doesn't echo here anymore, but neither does the sound of betrayal. That silence used to hurt. Now it feels holy. I still keep a chair by the window where Tom used to sit. Sometimes in the evenings, I pour 2 cups of tea out of habit. One for me, one for him. I'll sit there, looking out at the yard, listening to the wind through the oak tree and whisper, "We made it, love. We're home." It's a quiet life now, smaller in things but bigger in meaning. I tend my garden, I visit the library once a week, I talk to the neighbors when they walk their dogs past my gate. I don't need much, just a roof I can trust and a peace that doesn't depend on anyone else. And maybe that's what this whole journey has been about. Not revenge, not justice in the loud sense, but a quiet reclaiming. A reminder that even after everything's been taken from you, you can still take yourself back. Because peace, I've learned, isn't something people give you. It's something you choose. And once you find it, you guard it like gold. So now, when I close the curtains at night, I do it with a smile. I look around this house, the one Tom and I built, the one I fought for, and I whisper a little thank you. Not just to God or fate or luck, but to the woman I became through all this. The one who finally learned how to stop giving everything away. And if someone asked me today, "Helen, what did you gain after all that pain?" I'd tell them the truth in the simplest way I know. I gained myself. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you in any way, if it reminded you of strength, or of forgiveness, or of your own quiet fight, I hope you'll share it. Maybe it'll reach someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to start again. Because peace is the sweetest revenge there is. Gentle outro music fades, the sound of wind, a kettle, and sunlight through leaves.